Let's see. My education, I went to University of Washington, got my bachelor's there, and then worked 4 years, and then went and got my master's from UCLA, and worked in California for a few years with Koning Eisenberg and Frank Israel, and then moved to Seattle. I'm originally from Seattle, and my wife was fed up with living in LA, wanted to be closer to her family, and so we decided to move back. And it was good, but moving to Seattle, I think that was in the early 90s, 1992. There was so much more work going on in LA than in Seattle. Seattle was thought of as kind of a sleepy town still, I think, and not a whole lot happening. And so Frank Israel especially gave me a lot of crap for wanting to move back to Seattle. And he said, the only thing you should do if you move back to Seattle is start a school, because that's the only thing you're going to find satisfaction in. Like all architects, I think you feel like one day you want to start your own practice. And that was my goal in 5 years, start my own practice. And so I think being of Japanese descent, I felt like there'd be a lot of people coming to me asking me to do architecture that was either inspired by Japanese architecture or had Japanese detailing, neither of which I knew anything about, really. And so I felt like I could not exclude all those type of clients. When starting out, I would need to take any job I could get. And so I looked around, and George Suyama was known as probably the best wood detailing person around, kind of in the Northwest. And so I set my sights on trying to get a job here. And fortunately, he offered me a job, and I went to work in 92, and I've been here since. And so it's been, it's been an interesting, I think, a great relationship. He's been like a father figure, almost a mentor, which has been great. But I think we're of the same sort of generation. We're both third generation Japanese, and yet he's older. He was born in the internment camps or right before it. And so his sort of background on what it is to be Japanese is totally different than mine. And so I think what's really interesting is it was natural for him to rebel against the culture, I think, a little bit, because it was embarrassing during the World War II era, especially coming out of that. People didn't want to be associated with Japanese. So he found, I think, his connection not with the community, but with the architecture and the artifacts. And he became a huge a collector of Japanese antiquities, tansus, all these things, where I think for me, it was just the opposite. I was much more comfortable with the culture, with the Japanese American culture. I didn't have to go through the war. My parents and all grandparents had to deal with that. And so I was able to grow up in a much more unbiased, non-racial motivated situation. And so I thereby didn't necessarily need my Japanese heritage as much. I had the Japanese American culture. And so I think that was an interesting dynamic between how we grew up and our relationship now. And so that, coupled with, I think, his education versus mine and what we learned and what we were focusing on, we sort of realized that both of us had a lot to be learned from each other. And so I gained a huge amount of knowledge in sort of wood detailing, understanding of how things go together, the craft of things. There's an intuitive way that he designs that was not part of my school education at all. You know, everything was started out with an idea, and you hammered that idea home. So I think I learned a lot that way, but also then gave him this whole other layer of how you can add a certain philosophical idea about architecture, and that can add another layer to things that it didn't have before. And whether that adds more depth, I think that's always the dynamic, or the question is, does adding a philosophic aspect to the architecture make it any better? And in the end, how are you really evaluating? Are you evaluating just by how the space feels? Is the fact that someone can tell you a story make it better? I don't know. There are times when I think it does, but a lot of times it's sort of that inherent quality or innate ability to walk into a space and go, man, this is terrific. And how did it get there? And it doesn't matter what the background and what the designer was thinking. It's that they just created amazing architecture, and they created a place. And I think that's what what we're striving to do here is create architecture that's much more of the place, of a place, creating a place, but not of making an object. And so I think in terms of boundaries, when you think about making a place, it sort of goes beyond any boundary. That's just our sort of human condition desiring for what we are inherently or innately wanting. Prospect and refuge, those simple things in life that I think are still really relevant and valuable today. And so those are things that we still focus on. I think we're even getting back to that more in this era of computers and technology. I think we feel that people are sort of removed from that. And when they come home at night, they want something that's much more about the human condition and how man or woman used to be than what they're living in now at the workplace. So okay. I think the thing that's really was interesting, George did give me kind of the three questions that you were asking, and the boundaries of what we see today in terms of our things being pulled closer together, more separation, and I find that with the technology, boundaries are certainly reduced. Like people are finding us, we don't have a huge promo department and spend a ton of money on advertising or getting our name out there. It's sort of, people have to dig pretty hard. And with this sort of COVID-19 situation, people are able to spend a much greater time on the computer. And it's been interesting how many more, I think, calls we've gotten with people interested in what we do because they were able to dig deeper into finding us. Where before, I think they didn't have the time to sit down or really even think about what was important. They just either got a recommendation as who they should use as an architect or looked in magazines, and that was about it. And then they would just come across firms that were very savvy and getting a lot of exposure, or firms that had a huge marketing department that could provide enough, I think, social presence that they're out there, much more visible than we are. And so I think what's been interesting for us and that we're seeing more and more of is with people having more time to scour the internet, to have free time to just maybe think about things more. We're getting so many more calls because of that. And that's both for Seattle as well as California and other places around the world, actually. So. Okay, I'll talk about our moves first. One of the reasons why we did move out of Belltown one of the reasons we moved there first is because I think the architecture that we do isn't, it's not an overt manifestation of what we think architecture should be. It's a product of our environment. I think we're easily influenced just as human beings. And I think we try to be as authentic as we can. And so the move to Belltown was in 1996, 97. Belltown was a really rough area. Right. I think when we were in Eastlake was a sleepy but fairly upwardly mobile neighborhood right next to Lake Union. Right. And we were doing some high-end residential work. And I think what we felt is that we didn't have this other outside perspective on where the work was going. And I don't think we're oftentimes very good at being introspective enough to see where there's a fault, or maybe understand that there could be, and have enough strength to divert that energy into doing something new. We're clearly a product of our environment. And so the move to Belltown gave us an outlet and an inspiration that I think is difficult for us to draw on our own. Okay. So that was the move there. But then Belltown, we thought Belltown used to be the heart of Seattle, and it was, I think, an area that we felt a lot of artists congregated to. It was interesting, and it gave us sort of this edge to the architecture. It has changed in the last 20 years with a lot of large companies, a lot of high-tech companies coming in there. And when you walk down the street and even drive through Belltown, it's no longer Seattleites that are living there, it's all transplants. And because of that, I think it didn't carry the same Seattle vibrance or character that we were used to and that we wanted to surround ourselves with.
Okay.
So then that was the next move, to then move from there to South Park. And South Park is kind of the last bastion in Seattle. I mean, everything has been pushed out, and it felt like if you wanted to go someplace that was authentic and very Seattle-like, South Park was it. And so we took our firm and moved it here, where we think it gives inherently our work more authenticity in what we're doing. And we don't have to try so hard. We don't get wrapped up in who's looking over our shoulders or what people are seeing. We can just be ourselves down here outside of the main fray of things. And so that's why we moved. But we are old-fashioned in that way. I mean, I think we don't look at a whole lot of magazines or don't look through the internet a whole lot. And we still have drafting tables on every station in the office. Every architect has a main line and drafting. And you know, a lot aren't using it on a daily basis, but certainly George and I are all the time. And that's how the designs start. They start with a pencil on trays. And I think for us, it's like we tell the staff here, it's the difference between writing a letter with on a piece of paper and pen versus sort of on the computer typing things out. And I think it's different when you can write a letter on a computer because you have the ability to change it at any time. So maybe when you start that letter, you don't think it through as clearly or as deeply, because you know at any point you can just scrap it all and start over. Where when you're drawing it by hand, there's that sense that there's a little bit more permanence. And so you better have your thoughts together a little bit more clearly and more committed when you start. And I think that goes to speak about our process, is that hopefully there's enough investigation early that when we go to start to draw these things, that we're committed to it, and it's committed to it for the right reasons. That's a tough question. But I think when you think about architecture from the human condition and you think about boundaries, I think those boundaries are totally different than when you think about it from a philosophical sense. I think our boundaries are boundaries that an architect in Seattle could be dealing with, as well as someone in Japan. And they're human conditions. They are about prospect and refuge, about safety, about how you feel nurtured, when you want to feel nurtured, and then it's your daily environment, and when you need the respite or when you need to be pulled away from those things in order to, I guess, fulfill yourself. Or areas that you've been depleted along the way. And so I think that those boundaries are always there. The difference in, I think what's so interesting is I don't feel like there's as many, the boundaries aren't so severe that it's a difference between something that's happened in North America versus Europe. We're dealing with the same boundaries to a certain extent. But when you're dealing with those boundaries, there are the external conditions that then lead to a resolution, a solution to them that could be different in each scenario. And so I think the density of Tokyo or Hong Kong is going to be completely different than the density of Seattle, or the suburban Seattle versus the suburban China. And those things are what we look at. A part of our design process is, what is the inhabitant having to do on a daily basis? When they come home to the residence, what do they need as contrast to deal with that, to be able to revitalize and go back the next day? And how does that then impact the architecture or influence it? And I think that's why we look at, we don't think the front door, we don't think of architecture as occurring right at the front door of a house, right? For us, we're taking into account how someone leaves the office, whether they travel by automobile, by mass transit, whether they walk from the bus stop to get to the house, because that is part of the entry sequence into the architecture. And we want to somehow embellish that or have that inform sort of what the architecture is going to be. And so I think a long-winded answer is that the boundaries aren't quite as diverse or different between the cultures and the different geographies as other architecture might be, because we're dealing with architecture from a much more primal aspect. So. And I think, you would think with the advent of technology and with more of it around, it might be more removed from our process. But it actually, I think we're finding it's just the opposite. That there's clients, different clients for everybody, but the clients that come to us, they're looking for ways to remove themselves from the daily grind, from the things where they're immersed in technology all day long. They need to be recharged. I was just talking to another publisher, and we were talking about, I was telling her the difference between watching a movie and reading a book. And I think now, and just observing my own kids, that they have more time on their hand, that they're actually reading a book more than they did before. And I think they feel they're doing it because they have more time. My feeling is they're doing it because they also have a lot more time to look on the computer, but because they're understanding this sort of slowing down, getting back to kind of what the essentials in life are really about. And that the COVID-19 scare of sort of the pandemic that's looming, I think the fragility of life, all these things have sort of given them a different perspective. And it's no longer about just looking for simple gratification of getting lost in a movie, which they still do, but they also are looking for a deeper, I think, rewarding aspect to reading a book. And I think that's the case with architecture, that we were looking at, sorry, changing course a little bit, but for our own website, not that we update it very often, but we were thinking of just adding more images. And the question was, what kind of images should we put on there? It's hard for us, I think, to put on images that show flamboyance of extravagance and, just a certain economic means that can only afford to do our work. There doesn't seem to be appropriateness in that. And so how do you then represent a firm where you feel like you are very aware of the situation and identify and care for what's going on in the world right now, especially the United States, and yet still want to somehow be able to attract a certain clientele. So it's looking at those images that then evoke a certain response that go beyond the superficial sort of architecture that you might see in certain magazines. So. But I think there is that layer of if you can understand how things are going to wear, how the material wears, how it informs a certain detail, then it actually can embrace that attitude even more. And so one thing, it's funny, as the materials have changed over the years, we used to put in oiled rub bronze handles for hardware. And on a pair of doors, that was fantastic. And, the clients would always be nervous because was there a lot of maintenance that was going to be required to keep the two handles looking the same? And I think for us, our response was always, we actually want the handles to wear different. And when we come back to the house 2 years from now, and one side is bright, one side is still dark, there's a beauty in that. And that beauty in not only is it the wabi-sabi you're talking about, but it informs the guest or the inhabitant about how the building is used.
Yeah.
And there's something that I think adds to then another layer of complexity about the architecture, about how a place is used, when you get a little bit more understanding through the material and through how things wear, that then that little bit of insight goes a long way to make that place much more special. But it is like if you think of designing a house that's 100-year house, or even a building that's 100-year building at least, I think you're not necessarily designing it you're designing it for that specific client, but you're also designing it for the people that follow I think what we've always told clients is that, you know, we definitely want to push you to do what's right for you, but make sure you do it what's right, because you'll find it might be harder to find 9 out of 10 people that like it and want to buy it immediately once you want to sell it. But you'll find the one person, the 1 out of 10, that will spend more because of what you've done. Yeah. And so because of that, then the architecture, and I think the architecture carries on, and it isn't so much a boundary of just here and there. It's the thing that just keeps moving, and we as people kind of move within and around it and through it. But it's not the static piece. It provides the datum in which life goes on. And I think that's the beauty of all architecture. The good buildings, they last forever. People are still making pilgrimages there to see them. And I think they're still impacting and resonating the architects that go on to study them, even now as when they were first created. And people might not be aware of it, but they feel it, right? Yeah. I think they can feel it. And that's what we keep telling, I think, our clients or potential clients, is that I think hopefully you go through our work, you don't quite understand it, but each time you come back, you'll glean more information, but you'll feel it. And it's through that experience, I think, that then allows people to really resonate with it in a different way. And if it was just a one-liner, I think people get bored and they would move on. But you know what we said, like so this bars or our office is in 2 pieces. We have a second floor as well. And so it used to be the saloon here that I'm sitting in, and then upstairs was actually a boarding house. It's got 10 rooms, but it was actually, I think, sort of a house of prostitution at 1.2 probably. But then our other side is completely white. And it's just the bright side where we're all working. But we did it that way to provide the contrast to this space. And it's sort of the 2 working together, I think, that then leads to a better product than just if we had all made it one bar or made it all white as one office. Is the gray area. It should be a gray area, right? And I think the gray area is, even if it is as clear as walking through the threshold of an opening and it's immediate, I think the gray area is your mind. That it still takes you the moment to decompress from one and go into the other. And so that is the human condition that provides us with that gray area. If we can't tolerate it, we'll create a bigger gray area, and as big a gray area as we need, I think. And so it doesn't oftentimes have to be done by architecture. It can be done by the inhabitant. Yeah, I think gray areas are essential in everything. It is funny. I would say that I think you could look at it both ways. If you're a glass half empty person, you would say, no, it doesn't. And because you're still dealing with racial prejudices, you're still up against, it feels like there are certain conditions and times where we're at a disadvantage. And even in today, and George has built this huge practice, or this, it's very established, and yet we still find the resistance. I think you could look at it the other way, and I think I'm much more inclined to look at it as we are lucky to have 2 cultures to pull from. And I think it is, and it's like the work. Our work isn't sort of singularly focused. It's this sort of layering of all these things that come together. And our solutions aren't just about one solution. It's about a number of things that then lead to an end result. And because of that, I think you could say that having the multiplicity of cultures has added this other layer that we can pull from, or other background that we can pull from, that certainly adds, at least we feel adds to the work in the end.